In this Principles of Persuasion voiceover lecture, our focus is on visual argumentation and how you might apply some of the elements and principles of persuasion that we've been discussing throughout this semester to various different visual media forms. Throughout this lecture, and in several YouTube parts, we'll first examine different ways we might understand the definitions and applications of visual arguments in our increasingly new-mediated society. We'll then turn our attention towards understanding some of the key questions and considerations for principles and elements of design. Finally, we'll turn our attention towards examining some visual argument examples and asking ourselves some key questions of analyses. You might find these questions of consideration and these principles of design valuable not only in your upcoming FAT campaign paper, in which you might be examining some media of your own, but also in your future as you might apply these to various forms of art or entertainment that you engage in with the rest of your life. Toward that end, I hope these questions and principles provide us a fruitful understanding of how we might think about new media and some of the ways that visual elements of design are changing in our contemporary circumstances. We began our discussions in this course by defining argumentation and laying out some fundamental models for the way we might understand the argumentation process. You might recall the definition we provided early on of a rational argument as being that of a claim that's backed up by some data or grounding, which is supported by reasoning or an expression of warrants. Together, claim, data, and warrants define rational arguments and present us with a basic model or definition of an argument. Similarly, as we think about visual arguments, those operate through a similar model. But just as we discussed rational arguments breaking down in the sense that many times when we express arguments with friends, family, or in the media, we don't fully express claim, data, and warrants. We simply express a claim, and we hope our audience is able to infer from shared knowledge, worldviews, and previous perspectives the data or the warrants that we would hope that they would infer. In this sense, we might think about the way that visual argument also requires an inference capacity from its audience. What I mean by this is, in the same way that we describe many arguments being enthematic or requiring the audiences to infer the conclusion, visual arguments are very similarly enthematic. Most visual arguments present an argument for or against a particular side, but oftentimes without clear expression of the data, the warrants, the qualifiers, or the reservations and rebuttals contained therein. In that sense, they require the audience to infer those additional elements. Perhaps our most common experience engaging visual arguments is in the form of advertisements. We previously discussed advertising in the context of social marketing campaigns, and in doing so, we described how advertisements are designed to make a particular product look appealing or otherwise associated with a particular identity or lifestyle. However, ads are only one type of visual argument. You might think about how in the sciences, graphs and charts and various different forms of visual data are conveyed in ways that act as compelling evidence. Or in movies, it might be sophisticated editing techniques that are utilized to persuade particular emotions. And so in this sense, in almost every discipline, there's some sort of visual media and messaging happening, and it might be up to us as scholars of communication to think about how various different genres utilize visual media to better communicate their messages in campaigns. I want to use part of the time in this course lecture to refresh us on some of the key concepts that we've crossed earlier in the semester. One of those, and one I certainly hope you recall and remember, is the Toulamin model. The Toulamin model creates 5 different parts or elements that we can analyze in any argumentative message. Oftentimes, these elements or parts of the message are implied by an audience who's expected to have shared knowledge or understanding of the elements that are absent. In this sense, those absent elements are described as implied claims or implied grounding, implied reasoning that the audience should deduce from their own previous understandings, their own shared worldview, or their own association with culture and community. We've previously described the enthymeme as requiring the audience to be able to infer the conclusion of an argument. I'd like you to think about how visual argumentation similarly requires the audience to be able to lean in, think about the context and the various different symbolism included in the message, and be able to deduce its meaning in the same sense or the same intent that the author, artist, or creator had. In this sense, visual media is much like the Toulamin model we've described, and it often requires a certain enthematic association of those various missing parts, and we, as smart critics of communication and scholars of media and messages, are the best to be able to do that. When we think about applying some of those elements of persuasion that we previously learned to various different visual campaign media, we might think about the way that those can help us understand different kinds of genres. When we define genres, we're talking about categories that are characterized by similarities in form, style, and function. In this sense, there are various different new media genres. We might think about things like posters, brochures, web pages, movies, and even commercials as distinct forms of visual media, which we can each categorize, and in doing that, we can know some of the do's and don'ts, the rules or the better conventions that we can apply to create those media. But it's not just the design genres that we should be analyzing as we try to package these various different forms of media into containers. We should also ask ourselves what we might be able to research or learn about the authors, the creators, and the artists behind those various different designs. And it's not just the artists, but it's also those circulating, producing, or otherwise sharing and resharing those various forms of media. And it's also important, as scholars of communication, we think about the medium. Famous communication theorist Marshall McLuhan once said, "The medium is the message." And by talking about the medium, we're talking about the various different channels of media that communication moves through. Of course, television is one medium, but now we've evolved a number of different mediums of communication, including different formats and platforms like Snapchat or Facebook, which all might fit into the medium of social media. And so as these different forms of media create new forms of communication, Marshall McLuhan theorizes that they might help us learn more about communication, culture, and society more broadly. In this sense, we should analyze why particular mediums are chosen by particular platforms or particular creators and artists. Of course, classically, when analyzing any visual communication or analyzing art on the wall, it's important to think about the subject of that art and the intent that the artist might have had in producing it. Similarly, when we think about new media, it's important we think about the particular reasons why subjects are chosen for that expression and what the intent or symbolic representations behind those intents might be. Finally, there's a whole field of communication and media studies devoted to reception and audience studies. In this sense, it's thinking about how various different audiences, perhaps sympathetic, supportive, and neutral audiences, otherwise embrace media and the messages associated with different campaigns. Perhaps you've heard the story of somebody who sent out a memo in Comic Sans and otherwise been ridiculed for their silly choice of font. This is a good example about both the importance of font and the reason why typefaces are worthy of our consideration when we create designs, and also an indication of the importance of design conventions. Again, when we talk about design conventions, we're talking about those rules that police right and wrong. Oftentimes those rules are unspoken and that become known over time through experience. Of course, in the context of sending formal letters, most of us now know that using Comic Sans would be an unfortunate font choice. And so we might think about more appropriate font choices, and of course as we continue our discussions of visual communication today, we'll describe some strategies for choosing typeface and font. In addition to some of those design conventions that regulate things like typeface, we'll also discuss ways we might best analyze things like the layout and arrangement of various different visual media, as well as the ways we might apply things like color theory or symbolism to analyze both color and the various different types of objects or props included in visual media. Additionally, it's also important to think about how visual media are designed with strategic choice of graphics, various different forms of symbolism, and images which are included to otherwise connect to other media and create certain brand associations. These might be opportunities to think critically about how we might apply them to past theories like social identity theory or narrative theory, which discuss how these symbolic connections can be important to audiences.